How do you create a pivot table in Excel? First, you need a data source for the pivot table to reference. The data source can be any list of data. The only thing you need to have in your data is a column that has repeating values. You could create a pivot table from data that didn't have repeating values, but if you did that, you'd get all the same data in the pivot table as you had in the data source because there's no way to summarize or group the data. Having a repeating value in one of the columns of the data source gives you something to summarize the data on. So let me show you how to create a pivot table using the pivot table icon and using a field to summarize that data on within rows of the pivot table. To create the pivot table, you would select any cell within the data source. Click the Insert tab on the command ribbon. Click the pivot table icon. At this point, you could just click OK to create the pivot table on a new worksheet. But if you want to be able to see the pivot table along with the data source, you should click the Existing Worksheet Radio button, click inside the Location text box, then select the cell where you want the top left corner of the pivot table in the worksheet. Then click OK to create the pivot table placeholder. Now to populate the pivot table, drag the field with repeating values, in our case the region field, from the field list to the rows area. This will display each unique region as a row in the pivot table. As a final step, drag the field you want to summarize in the pivot table, in this case the Locations field, from the field list to the Values area. This will display the total location count for each region in the pivot table. Just like that, you have a pivot table. If you compare the data in the pivot table to the data in the data source, you'll see that each row in the pivot table displays a unique region name in the first column and the total number of locations for that region in the second column. There are many things you can do with a pivot table. If you'd like to learn more about pivot tables, check out some of my other videos.